Hi, everyone. You're listening to the Engineering Politics Podcast. Today is the second part of a long conversation I had with Truman from Return to Reason. We continue our conversation on the shifting hierarchy at large in America, and therefore around the world today. Because this conversation was so long, almost 3 hours to be exact, we decided to split it up into 3 different podcasts. This will be the Engineering Politics Podcast number 17, 18, and 19. But if you want a good foundation for this discussion, since this is a topic we've expanded on in several podcasts already, listen to the Engineering Politics Podcast number 16 to get caught up. And because it's a long podcast, there will be no bonus content at the end. But I would still appreciate you joining and subscribing to the Engineering Politics Locals community. You can go to engineeringpolitics.locals.com and become a member for free, or get a subscriber pass for as little as $2 per month. And you can use promo code EPFREE for a 3-month free trial of the subscription pass. That's spelled EPFREE. I'll go over more of where you can find me and support this content after the show. And also make sure to show some support for Truman of Return to Reason. You can find Truman and join his locals community at returntoreason.locals.com. If you like the Engineering Politics Locals community, you'll love the Return to Reason Locals community too, so go check them out. Alright, let's get this started. This is the Engineering Politics Podcast.
So that people kind of understand exactly what we're talking about and fleshing that out a little bit. So we've kind of stated the why we're doing this, and you're tired, I'm tired. You know, I think it's no accident we're both wearing gray. You know, just like just kind of the bleh kind of color, but that's okay. We're both wearing gray, but this still matters, and we've kind of articulated why it matters. And so I think it's still good to make good on our promise that we put at the end of our last conversation, which was we introduced this idea, and let's give some examples of what do we mean whenever a hierarchy becomes corrupt. What are some examples of a hierarchy becoming corrupt, and how do we know? Are there any signs that are like what you would say telltale signs, red flags, whatever, that the hierarchy has become corrupt? And what do you do as a result of it? So what's a healthy hierarchy look like? What's an unhealthy hierarchy look like? How do you know? So it seems like a good transition into that. So it gives people some practical examples so they kind of know what it is we're freaking talking about here. So we're not just spinning our wheels, doing some of that, navel gazing that Shapiro likes to talk about. Everything's navel gazing for him, and that's fine because there's a whole heck of a lot of that going on. So for those of you that don't know, Kevin and I talked after our last conversation. We talked about some examples, and there were some thoughts we kind of kicked around, and I said, yeah, I'll research some of this stuff. Some of it's out of a book that I read. I'll send you some notes, and I didn't send Kevin any notes until very, very recently. So this is on me because I suck. None of that's new information. But regardless, he has the notes in front of him now. I don't know if you can look at those without it closing your camera out. I don't know if I can do that on my screen if I minimize the program here. But the 2 examples that are practical, one of them is in a hospital, and the other one is Jim Crow. So specifically, we're talking about, okay, the way hierarchies, to give it quick 30-second, please don't time this whenever I say that, explanation is hierarchies form as needs need to be met, and people come together to meet needs. Those who are best at meeting the need and providing inputs into meeting the need rise to the top of the hierarchy out of what you say is competency. This competency hierarchy. Therefore, the hierarchy is established to meet the need. The hierarchy was created organically because a need needed to be met. And as long as the hierarchy meets that need, then it's fine that it's functioning the way it's supposed to. The minute a hierarchy starts to deviate from its original stated purpose, which is to meet that need, then it starts to become corrupted. And usually one of the best ways to indicate that, or what the outcome is that the people at the top of the hierarchy starts to serve just the people at the top rather than the need it was originally created to meet. And there needs to be input put into the hierarchy of people outside of the hierarchy, or maybe at the bottom of the hierarchy, or a little bit of both, to say, hey, this is what you said you were supposed to be doing. here are the ways in which you are no longer prioritizing what your originally stated goal was, and so that the hierarchy can self-correct. The hierarchy becomes corrupt whenever it's no longer interested in meeting its original need, original goal, and it's only serving the interests and prosperity and comfort of those at the top. And there has to be people outside of the hierarchy or kind of somewhere at the bottom or related to the hierarchy that can provide feedback into it to help self-correct, and whether it's get rid of the people at the top who are only interested in serving their own, desires, or helping right the ship by whatever other mechanisms possible. That has to happen as well. So there's hierarchy, they're good. They have a propensity for corruption, that's bad. There needs to be inputs into the hierarchy to identify when it becomes corrupt, and that's a good thing, that the hierarchy has a feedback mechanism to identify when it becomes corrupt. Kevin, did I miss anything? I know that wasn't 30 seconds, but does that sound right?
No, I mean, the one that I probably wouldn't have thought of before one of our past talks is the communication aspect. That's one of the first red flags you see when a hierarchy is becoming rigid and starting to become corrupt, is lines of communication are cut. That feedback is no longer useful, and you can't reform, because a hierarchy can reform and maintain, right? But that's what we talk about when rigid, right? Hierarchies can be more fluid. There's some movement inside the hierarchy. That is when it's healthy. When it starts to become rigid and there's no feedback, that feedback is all cut off. The communication is cut off, and you're starting to see no movement, mostly because the people at the top can now suppress and kind of build a shield to make sure they maintain and stay on the top. That's when it starts to become rigid and becomes corrupt.
Yep. Okay, cool. So the two examples that we talked about, and then we didn't really talk about how we wanted to do this, but these are good examples, and I still think worth covering. Is I can kind of introduce them. Kevin, maybe you can ask some questions, provide some insights. I can give maybe the raw facts of these particular cases, and then you can kind of give your commentary on it. So there was, like I said, there's a hospital, and then the other one that is obviously very relevant that most people can identify with is the Jim Crow South. So I thought we could talk about the hospital one first, and then the Jim Crow one, and then we can bring it back to the hospital in terms of how there's an example. You'll see it in the notes where what does it look like once they fix the corruption in the hierarchy, and I think that seems like a good end cap for this portion of the conversation. But so there was a book that I read called The Power of Habit. I believe the author's name is Paul Duhigg. I know Duhigg's the last name. I could be off on the first name. And he talks about the way people develop habits as individuals, as corporations or movements, whatever, and then he moves to societies. And in his section on groups, companies, whatever, he talks about the power of crisis, which we'll get into here in a minute, which is actually might be a better end cap for this whole thing. But he gives a couple examples of how there were places that had become very rigid in their hierarchy. Now Duhigg doesn't use this terminology, but it's the exact same. And he gives the example of there was the London Underground, their subway station, which we're not going to talk about, and Rhode Island State Hospital, which we will talk about. And what had happened in both of those cases with the Underground, they had developed habits and norms and what he calls like compromises or just little procedures that help people to deal with problems within the hierarchy. But whenever truces, that's what he calls them, truces. Anytime there's those truces introduced, sometimes they're fine and they keep the trains running on time, but they can still be dangerous. So in the London Underground, there were these truces, but they didn't have anything to address dangers. Fire breaks out. He gives us very long and dramatic recounting of this fire that happened there where a bunch of people died, and the ensuing crisis that was able to help them reform the system. And it's actually super interesting. I highly recommend it to people. But the one for our purposes here is Rhode Island State Hospital. And so, again, if we were to say a hierarchy is a system where people come together to meet a need, and those who are best at meeting that need rise to the top of the hierarchy, and those who are able to help feed that need, are still in the hierarchy, but probably not at the very top, are at other parts in the maybe upper to upper middle to the middle lower of the hierarchy. And so a hospital is a hierarchy that is created to take care of people's health, to cure diseases. Kevin, do you have any other thoughts on what a hospital hierarchy might be dedicated to do that could feed into this?
To bill
example?
me as much as they can. No, that's
that is so true.
But yeah, I mean, you hit the point. And even before we move on, it's important to note when you talk about a hierarchy, there's just not just one hierarchy. There are hierarchies, there are sub-hierarchies. People are operating in much more than one hierarchy at one time. Hierarchies have a context. And in this specific one, this is in the context of one hospital, not a bunch of hospitals, but one. And then obviously the second one we get to is a much larger context in the hierarchy. But I think it's important to know.
No, that's exactly right. The hierarchies often overlap, right? That's one of the things we talked about last time. They often overlap. So the Rhode Island, the way that this chapter opens up, Kevin, are you able to look at the notes where I think I have the quote from an interaction between a doctor and a nurse there? If I minimize it, I think my camera goes to blank. Could you read that little interaction at the very beginning where she goes to call a timeout and the way the doctor responds? Can you see that?
Yeah. I'll do my best. I've been drinking enough of this where I'm a bit tipsy, but hopefully the dyslexia won't kick in. So doctors made the nurses feel worthless. That's kind of the intro to it. So the timeouts part is what you want me to hit on? Yep. The timeouts were implemented to prevent accidents from occurring during surgery as a way of making sure everyone was on the same page before the patient went under the knife. Incidents such as tonsils being removed from a patient who was supposed to have eye surgery served as an underscore to underscore the necessity of timeouts. Keep going.
Okay. Yeah. Keep going.
Okay. A typical scene in the operating room went something like this. The OR nurse calls a timeout. The doctor leaves because it's not important to them. Nurse asks doctor to stay. Doctor replies with this: "If I want your damn opinion, I'll ask for it. Don't even question my authority again. If you can't do your job, get the hell out of my OR." The nurse was never contradicted by the surgeon again. And even when safety policies were ignored, she wasn't allowed to provide feedback into the hierarchy.
That's correct. No, we're fine. It's okay. So the part that Kevin just read is an actual quote from this book. So basically what happened at Rhode Island State Hospital is we have these surgeons, and for whatever reason, he never gets into this, and that's totally fine. For whatever reason, the dynamics between the surgeons and the nurses had become such that it's a very toxic environment where the nurses could not provide feedback with the surgeons. And so they had implemented these things called timeouts, which is where they kind of all get on the same page before surgery. And it was a way of, whether it's all the nurses, the other techs who are in the room, whatever, to say, here's what we're going to do. We all know we can express our concerns, whatever. And what had happened whenever they started implementing these timeouts, and this timeout started because they were operating on people wrong. People were getting wrong surgeries. He later goes on to describe people who had cleft palate and they operate on the wrong side of the mouth. There was someone who was supposed to have eye surgery and they operate on their tonsils. Like, there was people who they operate on this one leg instead of the other. I mean, it's really crazy stuff. But a lot of it was because they could not provide, the nurses weren't able to give any feedback with the surgeons. And so again, I don't know what created this toxic, corrosive environment, but regardless, it created an environment where nurses were not comfortable providing feedback. And the example that Kevin read, it was from the book, is a direct quote, is an actual incident that happened, which is where they implement these timeouts, right? Because people are dying, because people are getting surgeries on the wrong parts of their body, which is freaking crazy in and of itself. I know it happens, but it was happening in larger portions at Rhode Island State Hospital. And the nurse says, hey, we're supposed to do these timeouts. You're supposed to lead these, or you're supposed to be here for these. And the doctor is like, no, I got other stuff to do. I think you can do it. And he's going to go out and make a phone call. And the nurse said, which I didn't include in that, I didn't transcribe the whole thing, but the nurse said, I think this is inappropriate. You're supposed to be here. And that's when the doctor says, if I want your damn opinion, I'll ask for it, right? That's what he says. If you're going to contradict me, get the hell out of my OR. What's another way of categorizing someone giving their feedback? What's another way, or their opinion? What's another way of categorizing that?
Yeah, I don't know. Sufficient communication upward, or well, not even feedback is sufficient communication anywhere.
Yeah, it's communication, it's feedback. So the doctor says, I don't want your feedback into the hierarchy. I don't want you to provide feedback into what I'm doing here. If I wanted it, I'd ask for it. So he's closed the loop of feedback into the hierarchy. He's at the top of the hierarchy as a surgeon, and he's closed the loop off from the nurses. And what happens? People start to die. There's another example of there's a man who I believe he's 86. He has this, it's not a contusion, I forgot what it's called, but where he has this fluid building in one part of his brain. And a nurse, when they go to do surgery, the way they do it is they cut this triangle out of their skull, and then they see a little sac in there, and they puncture it, and it relieves the pressure. The man had like fallen and hit his head, something like that. Hematoma, I think it's called a hematoma. And the nurse was like, we don't have which side we're supposed to start. We don't have the consent, whatever. And again, Duhigg gives this long, very well written, dramatic account of what occurred. And she's saying, like, look, we need to make sure we get the right information here. And the doctor says, I'll tell you what, you can do that. I'm going to save this man's life. And he writes right, as in the right side of the man's head, on the sheet because it wasn't put on there. And she was just trying to go and confirm which side are we supposed to operate on. And the doctor wasn't having it. And Duhigg writes about how the way they do it, they cut the scalp and they do all this other stuff. And then they use this saw to cut this triangle out, and they open up this part of this man's skull, and the hematoma wasn't on the right side. So you have to put it back. They put these plates on, screw it back in, sew the scalp back up, turn him over, and then they find the hematoma was actually on the left side. And by then it was too late, and the guy died a couple weeks later from just trauma. His body couldn't heal. It's weird. It's almost like it's really hard for your body to have multiple holes cut in your skull. And so things like that were happening. And a large part of it was the nurses couldn't provide feedback with the surgeons. Another thing that Duhigg outlines is that there has to be a commitment on all parts of the hierarchy. Again, I'm using our language here. There has to be a commitment on all parts of the hierarchy to open communication and open respect in terms of serving the purpose of the hierarchy. So in the case of Rhode Island Hospital, only the nurses are interested in trying to right the ship. Well, that's kind of a problem, right? Because they're the ones at the bottom trying to provide feedback in the hierarchy. So another way of thinking about it, and give me your thoughts on this, is if the only people interested in righting the ship, if the only group interested in providing feedback into the hierarchy and assessing the ways in which it might be becoming corrupt are those outside of it or those at the bottom of it, then we have a problem. Kevin, do you have any thoughts on that in terms of why do the interests have to match up of the people, various people?
So in my job, I'm in a management position, and normally most companies that do that will send you to some sort of management course or bring someone in or do some sort of seminar or something like that. And this is the central principle of every single one of those courses is communication. And it's also just way of thinking. It seems like a doctor like this not only cuts on communication, but there's kind of this righteousness that I'm on top, you're on bottom. We're gonna, the respect only goes one direction.
Yep.
That was it seemed like the exact problem that they had that started all of this. So in any management course, you're going to have to say open line of communication, willingness to feedback, not only willingness to feedback, but willingness to ask for feedback when some people may not be prepared to give it or be, like I'm on bottom. I mean, the dynamics happen the same way. When someone's on top, they think they're on top and they get a big head about it. That's a problem. Also, when someone's new, someone's on bottom and they're too quiet to give feedback, that's also a problem. So any good manager, any good superior is going to ask for feedback, not only just wait for it. But, every single person that goes into a company to assess why they're not performing well, this is like almost the number one thing they find all the time is no line of communication from bottom to top. And when you lose that, I mean, you see it happen in a hospital like this. You can see it happen in a smaller company, but Like our behaviors don't change just because the hierarchy gets bigger, right? And this is something, and that's why it's kind of a good thing we started out with this one and didn't go to the big one first, is to understand even the smaller, relatively smaller hierarchies are going to act the same way as the large ones. And if you have the people at the top of the hierarchy completely saying to the people at the bottom, even this massive hierarchy, the one we're going to be talking about, no feedback allowed. Like we're better than you. We're inherently better than you. And when we don't give that feedback, we think this hierarchy is going to operate efficiently or even maintain its goals. That's a problem. That's a kind of a sickness you see in a lot of companies, and it manifests itself in larger hierarchies where it's cultures meeting together.
Yeah. And whenever I heard you say where they're no longer like, what'd you say, not interested in their goals, or they're no longer meeting their goals, they don't even care about the goals, or the goals have shifted to whatever we were originally trying to do, to preserving our power, preserving our status in the hierarchy. And that's one place where, that emphasis on power and power dynamics, some of the people in the critical theory and in some of this far left movement aren't wrong in at least acknowledging, in my view. They're not wrong in acknowledging that power does play a role in things. But again, to the original point earlier, power is only a problem to the degree in which it's exercised malevolently. Okay, so that's an example. So we spent, I think it was 2 hours and 9 minutes in our last video talking about hierarchies, and I was like, okay, all right, we've addressed it. I'm not going to go back over it. And so that's one practical example of a hierarchy that became corrupted. And one of the telltale signs of corruption is that feedback was not welcomed from the bottom, or maybe those outside of it, to the top of the hierarchy. So those at the top are starting to insulate themselves from feedback. And they're not just doing it by discouraging feedback, but they're using intimidation. They're using certain tactics to prevent that feedback from occurring. So it's not just, hey, I don't want your feedback. It's, I don't want your damn feedback. And if you have a problem, get the hell out of my OR. In other words, I'm going to threaten your very job security for even trying to provide feedback in this hierarchy. So I think it's important to distinguish that corruption in a hierarchy, closing yourself off from feedback is not the same as giving pushback against that feedback. Some of that feedback isn't necessarily correct, right? It's not necessarily right. And so someone in that hierarchy saying, well, wait a second, here's my thoughts on what you said, is not the same as it becoming corrupted. It becomes corrupted where it's, you're wrong, I'm not even going to entertain what you said, and if you keep saying it, there's going to be consequences. So that's different than, here's a substantive response to your feedback, or I just disagree and here's why, and so on and so forth. Does that make sense? That seems like an important distinction. So what we don't want to say is that all criticism is bad, or all criticism is correct.
Right.
Go on.
Again, it comes down to stated goal. If your stated goal is to help people, that's one thing. A lot of times in companies like this, the stated goals are not necessarily just left, at least when it comes down to the individual and the management role at the top of the hierarchy, when a lot of times it's ego that overtakes the stated goal. When it's wanting to, and that's another thing here, is when it's wanting to maintain your place in the hierarchy, that becomes more important than the actual motives or the actual goals of the hierarchy. Make a huge difference here. And I think we see that in large hierarchies as well.
Yep. Yeah. So it's a good transition to the other part, which is Jim Crow, right? So we wanted to give some examples to people of, so we're not just giving some abstract thoughts here. We're talking about, there are times that hierarchies can become absolutely corrupted, absolutely broken, and need to have feedback into them. Again, one of the ways in which you can tell that a hierarchy's become corrupted is whenever it starts to insulate itself from feedback and give actionable pushback to that feedback, where it's not just, I'm not interested, but I'm not interested, and if you keep going, here's what's going to happen. It gives threats. So I watched this documentary on Jim Crow, and I do want to ask you, because I think this is a very brief, I want to keep it very brief, aside worth talking about, but how much did you know about Reconstruction, or learn about Reconstruction and Jim Crow in the South, and then later in the greater United States as a result of Plessy. How much did you learn about that? How much did you know about that as just part of your regular education?
Well, I'd say I was truly privileged to be able to go to private school for grade school. So my experience may not be the exact same as your typical public school. That it seems the feedback I hear is we weren't taught enough about slavery. In grade school, for me, we were taught a bunch about slavery. And we didn't get in. The problem is with someone like Jim Crow, which I've heard of in grade school. The big gripe is like, what policy things did you learn when you were 8 years old about Jim Crow South? To me, my response is like, what the hell do you think I'm doing when I'm in grade school? Like, no one's going to teach us this stuff because it's just too sophisticated. Like, we don't understand the nuance behind some of this stuff. So I think that's why it's often skipped over. Like, I would suggest teaching about slavery when you're young. And even I asked my son and even daughter who go to public school, and they've been taught about slavery. Like I read them a book about like Martin Luther King, and I kind of explained like, do you understand what happened? Like, oh yeah, we were told about this stuff. So it's not like these kids aren't being told about it. It's just they're being taught about some of the symptoms, not being taught about what was the cause of those symptoms. And that's understandable. And if we're going to talk about, someone dropping the ball education wise, that's going to be higher education. And I would even say past high school, if you want to learn more about it, that's something you have to learn when your brain's developed enough to understand this cause and effect type of policy stuff. So that's my little piece on it. I know maybe it wasn't what you're expecting, but.
No, that's fine. That's fine. What I will say is that I didn't learn a whole heck of a lot about it whenever I was in school. I knew that we learned about the Underground Railroad. We learned about slavery and, of course, the Civil War. But it seemed like we kind of, that the time after the Civil War, so most middle school history texts go from the Civil War, a little bit in Reconstruction, and then it's all Manifest Destiny for a while. It's Lewis and Clark, it's westward expansion, and there's not a lot of oxygen given to the racial dynamics of what took place and the just complete abject injustice of what happened in the southern states after Reconstruction ended. And then they basically just skip up to World War II. Really, they don't give, or the stock market crash. They don't usually give anything to World War I in all reality. But so if we're going to say a hierarchy becomes corrupt whenever it no longer provides feedback or outside feedback into the possibility of corruption, and it starts to serve its own interests rather than what its original goals were. Jim Crow is about as perfect an example as you can get whenever it comes to these things becoming corrupted. And one of the things that I learned about that I did not know much about was what happened during Reconstruction, right? So we have the Civil War ends, and the South and the North are united, but only kinda, right? And so we begin to reconstruct the South, and we have the formation of things like the KKK. I think I put in my notes there that Ulysses S. Grant and the KKK, or Ulysses S. Grant was elected in 1869, and he sent federal troops to the South. This was the same year as the KKK. Actually, I think it was official Reconstruction. And the KKK were founded in the same year. That's right. And so I didn't learn a lot about that. But one of the things that happened during this time period, so again, we're trying to cast this in the lens of, okay, so a hierarchy has certain goals, and how do we know when it becomes corrupt? So what happens during this time period is you have blacks being elected, blacks serving on juries, they start to succeed. And one of the things that starts to drive white racism in the South isn't the failure of blacks, but it's the success of blacks who were just like, they were under the impression we can start to pursue the American dream now, right? We can start to do that. Shapiro's put a lot of oxygen towards Frederick Douglass's 4th of July speech when he says, what is this to the slave? Well, this hasn't, these are good promises. These are good goals in the Constitution here, but it doesn't apply to us. How's this supposed to mean anything to us? And so a lot of this, whether it was the early abolitionist movement, the actual Civil War, the Reconstruction period, or the Civil Rights movement, were all operating on the perfection and the execution of the Constitution of the United States. But either way, you have all these blacks that are like, okay, so we get to pursue happiness, right? We get to pursue life and liberty. And there starts to become a black middle class that emerges. And there are certain places where that's a problem for these whites. And I have these quotes in some of I put a timeline in the notes that I sent you about how in the go ahead.
So I can read a good quote that kind of sets up, it's your intro quote to this one, I think does set up a good job of what, right after you free the slaves, what was the idea? Like, what was the vision behind it? Because this is another good example of just like the doctor thing. I think this was ego. There's a little bit of ego in there. That's like, why are these people that are down here raising up when they're genetically inferior, right? So there's an ego at play in there. And something you put from Governor Benjamin Humphrey is the Negro is free whether or not we like it. For their purity and ours, they must accept their place in the lower order of things. That place is in the cotton fields in the South, such is the rule of the plantation and law of God. So right there, you're setting the tone for these people. And maybe that was used kind of as a motivation. Maybe, people who don't agree with that assessment, like the blacks did in the South, that's motivation to start electing your own people and to be able to kind of expand this idea of where we can go, where we ought to be, to prove that we are not some subhuman species. We are equal to you. And then when that happens, you're pushing back on this hierarchy. In a healthy hierarchy, they would have accepted it. In the rules of free market capitalism, we're accepting people because all we're doing is growing the talent pool. And that's what you want. If you discriminate in your hiring practices, all you're doing is making the talent pool smaller. You no longer have a chance to be the best company ever, because there's no possibility that if you eliminate a large section of the population, you're going to be able to hire the best people. It just doesn't work that way. Where we start here, where the preconditions are you're subhuman, and that's where we're launching off. And then you see these subhumans get better. Well, you got to make changes to maintain that rigid hierarchy.
Yep.
So to set up what you're saying.
No, that's exactly right. And so, I want to get into an anecdote that kind of flushes that exact sentiment out, and that's of Ida B. Wells. So if we're going to say, how do we know when a hierarchy becomes corrupt? How do we know that it's no longer serving the purpose it's supposed to serve? Well, you tell me, Kevin. Government's a hierarchy. The courts are a hierarchy. Law and order is a hierarchy. What's the purpose of those hierarchies? What are they supposed to serve? You tell me. What are those things supposed to serve?
Well, when you got to take them in the context of whichever department or branch you're getting them in, and the funny thing is we don't know anymore, and that's a problem already. It was when you're starting to scope drift in a lot of these different branches, when the executive branch is now the legislative, because the legislative is no longer taking an active role in legislating. They're just making vague policy that can be changed with an executive order. That becomes a problem. And that's, again, one of the red flags of seeing when a hierarchy becomes corrupt is not only are they maintaining this rigidity, they're also pushing their responsibilities and therefore their accountability off into another place. When I'm no longer accountable for what I do, and this is what you brought at the very beginning of the podcast, when you said the Beach Boys compared to the who did you compare them to?
I said the Beastie Boys are Good Charlotte.
Beastie Boys. There we go. Yeah. Ugh, Good Charlotte. We'll go with Beastie Boys. But why I don't want to grow up is removal of accountability. That's the biggest thing. When I'm accountable, I'm an adult now, and I don't like that feeling, because when I'm accountable, I can fail. I can't fail if I'm not accountable for anything. And that's what we're seeing, at least with the legislative branch. Like, I want to keep getting voted in, so I don't want to look bad to my constituents. But if I run the risk of being good, it's like, well, I got to put my neck out there. If I lose this bet, then, I get chopped off. Neck gets chopped off. So that's one way that we kind of see, in a weird way, that hierarchy just pushes, all of their work off to someone else and remains unaccountable. And that's a big red flag when it comes to
Wait, so
government.
let's say without the corruption, if you were to, in one sentence, what is the goal of government and law and order, right? Law and order government. What's the goal in one sentence?
To govern the people and maintain liberty effectively. Or really, it's kind of hard to say government in general. Governments have different objectives depending on what their pillars of belief are. But
Sure.
in the American context, it's certainly to maintain individual rights.
That's right. Yeah. So, yeah, I think that's exactly right. My thought, I'm not sure this, I think this is a distinction without a difference, but it's to maintain and protect the rights of the citizens. That's it.
Right.
And so we have these hierarchies in place. And like I said, I want to look at the anecdote of Ida B. Wells as a way of helping us understand how this hierarchy became corrupted, and kind of giving us a little bit of a window into Jim Crow. Because what I don't want to do, and I don't think this is wrong necessarily. What I don't want to do is try to talk about, like I said at the beginning, we can talk about this in a sanitized academic way, and that's fine. There's lots of people who are very good at presenting information. I think our last episode we presented information really well, and I don't have any issues with that. I recommend people watch it. But this is a window into, like you were talking about at the beginning, of why you do what you do, of giving the perspective of things, of giving a different perspective. I think her story gives us a different perspective and gives us a little bit more intimate understanding of what it's like to experience a hierarchy that's become corrupt, and how that can maybe inform what we're seeing today. So Ida B. Wells was a school teacher. She was a Black woman who lived in Memphis, Tennessee, in the post-Civil War era. And one thing that happened during that time is there were these Jim Crow laws that were implemented. They were very loose. They weren't they weren't a government thing necessarily. They're really more policies. I know I said Jim Crow laws, but they're really more policy of private industry. And one of the one of the kind of explanations for them coming to be is exactly what we talked about earlier, which is Black success. People said, well, okay, Blacks and whites have always been kind of segregated. There's been these things, we were able to achieve a kind of hierarchy of value in terms of the societies, just by virtue of convention or cultural norms. But Blacks are succeeding. We're seeing a Black middle class rising up. Because spoiler alert, they're humans, and so humans can succeed. There's not a difference here between Black and white. They were just held back. They're going to do what any other human would do here, which is find a way to succeed. But there were all these whites who were very surprised by this. And so they pressure different companies and entities to implement these policies. And so one of the earliest Jim Crow policies was put in place by certain locomotive train companies. And so they had this car in the train that was only for Blacks and for men who wanted to smoke and drink. And Ida B. Wells was a school teacher. She was dressed properly, and a conductor told her she needed to go to this other car. And she said, no, I'm dressed properly. I'm a school teacher. I'm not going to go. And he tried to force her up. He tried to physically move this woman who was just minding her own business. And she writes in her diary, I think it was, she sinks her teeth into his hand, bites him. And they have this altercation. And she's like, I'm not going to move. And she doesn't move. And whenever they get to Memphis, when she's coming back home, she's got her dress is torn, her hat's all messed up, but she didn't move. And she gets off and she sets out to sue the train company, the locomotive company that was trying to make her move. And she wins. Because the judge says, no, she's right. She was dressed properly, because that was a thing that people, factored in at that time. This is a woman. She's a school teacher. She's dressed properly. She did not need to move. Her race is irrelevant. They were wrong to move her. But, and here's the but, and this is the part that's really tragic. the Tennessee Court of Appeals, the company appeals it, and the Tennessee Court of Appeals sides with them, and they overturn the ruling. So her lawsuit is thrown out. She loses. And this is a quote that she says, I have here. I want to read. That really, okay, so if we think about a hierarchy that is functioning means I can provide feedback. It's doing what it's supposed to be doing. Listen to Ida Wells's quote here and tell me that this does not give you some window into what happens when our hierarchies become corrupted, and it's now serving people at the top. She says, quote, this is after she finds out her ruling's been overturned. Quote, I had firmly believed all along that the law was on our side and would give us justice. I feel shorn of that belief and utterly discouraged. If it were possible, I would gather the race in my arms and fly away with them. And this part she gets into where it's almost like she's just lamenting. Really, this is almost biblical in a way. She says, God, is there no redress, no peace, no justice for us? Teach us what to do, for I am sorely, bitterly disgusted. And she's saying, where's the justice? I thought that the law was on our side. I thought that we could trust the institutions. I thought we could trust the hierarchies to do what they were supposed to do, which is to bring about law and order. And they don't. And she takes up the cause of Black rights in Tennessee. And she owned a general store, I believe, also. It was vandalized. At one point, she was out of the state, or at least out of Memphis, and it was broken into. And some of her friends came and defended it, and they were arrested for defending her general store. And this was the intimidation part. This is what the KKK and other white nationalists did, or white supremacists did, to try and fill in the gaps that the law at the time created. They're like, well, if we're not going to get you with the law, we're going to scare the hell out of you so that you know your place, so to speak. And a couple of her friends were arrested for defending her store. And then while they were in jail, so again, this is the law. If you're in jail, you are now in the custody of the state. They were drugged from their jail cells, taken out to some train tracks, and they were killed. They were lynched just for defending Ida Wells and her store. And she gives this other quote that again speaks to the time. And she uses the N-word here. I don't feel comfortable saying it. I'll say Negro because that was a term that was fairly common at the time, but it's still important to understand the perspective that she gives here and just how sickening and how perverse the mentality of the people in this corrupt hierarchy we're operating on. But whenever Ida Wells gets back and she finds her friends got lynched just for defending her general store, again, they were taken out of the government's custody, out of their jail cells, and they were killed, and there was no justice to be found for the men who killed her friends. She puts this in her journal, quote, this opened my eyes to what lynching really was, an excuse to get rid of Negroes who were acquiring wealth and property, and thus keep the race terrorized and keep the Negroes down. And Ida Wells realizes that the hierarchies are not functioning the way they're supposed to. Government isn't protecting their rights. They had trusted them. They weren't protecting their rights. The law enforcement, the courts weren't protecting them. And Ida Wells actually helps facilitate a mass exodus out of Memphis, Tennessee. That is originally there's like a group of 6,000 that leaves, and then it ends up being tens of thousands that leaves Tennessee. Why? Because the hierarchy had become corrupt and it was no longer serving the interest of everyone. It was only serving a small group. And it's really, really perverse. It's really perverse. And we'll get into the specifics of how they did this legally here in a second, using the Mississippi State Convention as an example. And this is all, again, a little bit academic, I guess, because there's dates and laws and people, but it's important to understand that we can look and all of us can not identify, but at least go, that's effed up, right? You hear that story of Ida Wells, that's effed up. She was just a school teacher. They were trying to make her get into a different train car. It's ridiculous. She's a human being. Her friends who are trying to defend her general store, they're human beings. Doesn't matter the color of their skin. All of us can hear that. Okay, so we're not trying to get people to, everyone who's listening or watching, we're not trying to get you to remember the dates and the names. The point is that whenever a hierarchy becomes corrupted and it's no longer, it starts to insulate itself from feedback, which we'll get into the details here in a second, is people like Ida B. Wells go, is there no justice? I thought that this was going to listen. I thought it was going to do what it was supposed to do, but it's not. And so we got to leave. We got to leave because we can't trust this hierarchy to do what it was supposed to do. Kevin, before we move on to the Mississippi State Convention, do you have any thoughts on that? I don't know if I even gave you an opening to provide thoughts, but
no, I wrote some stuff down. I mean, and that's a powerful statement. What I wish we would do, and what I wish we had the intellectual honesty to do today, is to use that as an example of a teaching moment of what happens when a hierarchy becomes corrupt. Instead of what we would do today and what we have done today when you're conflating past injustices with current day disparities, which is what a lot of the more dishonest people do. They say this thing happened in 1884 in the court system, therefore our court system today is racist. They're completely missing the whole point of what happened back then. And it's a teaching moment of what happens when this hierarchy becomes corrupt, and it really hurts people. I mean, most hierarchies, when they become corrupt, they're going to hurt people, but this is the most obvious, easy, out there example of that happening. And it would be much better if we can do what we're doing now and try to see it as a teaching moment, other than using it as I forgot his name, kind of using it as no crisis goes to waste kind of thing. Rahm Emanuel kind of making sure no crisis goes to waste. Well, in this case, this crisis shouldn't have gone to waste, and I hope it led to the end of Jim Crow. But we can't weaponize a tragedy like this to meet our end goals. And again, this is a very obvious red flag of what happens when you don't allow that mobility. Yep. And so it should be a teaching moment.
No, I think you're right. There seems to be this, and I really kind of brought up earlier whenever I asked you if you learned about this, to at least mention exactly what you said, which this needs to be a teachable thing. This needs to be something we learn from. The only thing we learned from this era, at least in my experience, is, again, about westward expansion. It's about Lewis and Clark. It's about, Teddy Roosevelt, national parks, all this stuff, the Industrial Revolution a little bit. We don't learn about people like Ida Wells. We don't learn about the 10 years in which Blacks developed these communities and they were succeeding. And then Rutherford B. Hayes, that piece of crap president, he's a Republican at the time, betrays the Blacks who trusted him, and he makes a deal with Democrats so that he can become president. He pulls the federal troops out of the South that Grant had put into the South. He ends Reconstruction. And as a result of Hayes doing that, then we get all these laws we're about to talk about. So there were these conventions, there were these norms, there were these what you would say societal habits of segregation that were taking place. Ida Wells experienced one unofficial, at least from a legal standpoint, aspect of that when it came to the train company, the railroad company. And there were people who wanted to make it official, who wanted to codify it into law. So Hayes gets elected in 78. It's the election of 77. The inauguration's in 78. And part of that was to pull federal troops out. So we had about a 10-year period of Reconstruction where Blacks, there's a middle class starting to develop again. They're serving in high offices. They're doing what any normal person would do. Skin color is so irrelevant. People are people. Humans are humans. And so they're doing what anyone would do, which is they're thriving once, people take the knee off their neck, as is the kind of common phraseology right now. And people are scared by this in the South, especially. The Democrats are very scared by this in places like Memphis, where Blacks were 40% of the population. My personal theory on this is that they saw Blacks succeeding after slavery. And I think that there were a lot of white people that understood what they deserved for being complicit and not fighting back against slavery. And they were afraid of Blacks being successful because they thought that it was going to come back on them. And that's just my personal theory, to be honest. But it makes sense to me that one of the things that stoked their fear is they might not even have been slave owners themselves, but there's lots of people who were like, what we did was wrong, and they're gonna come for us. They're gonna seek vengeance and retribution for what we did. And so I think that they operate out of a fear that was very, very much based in justice, not in the character of what they saw in Blacks or freedmen at the time, but in their own sins and their complicity in their own sins.
Isn't that the justification now? And that's white privilege right there, right?
That's right. That's right.
That is the justification now. And unless malicious, obviously, I don't think people think that they're going to be turned on or anything like that. But there's a sense of complicity, even though you share the same skin color as the people who own slaves. You have no relation to them, even if you were distant related to them. It's it's not going to go against your name just because you hold the same skin color as these people. But that type of behavior is weaponized, and it makes sense that may have been a motivating factor back then. We don't know the internal thoughts of those people, but it makes sense, and that's a powerful motivating factor there.
Yeah, and it's guilt and it's shame, and there's not a single person who lived in the South pre-Civil War, during the Civil War, right afterwards, who I think, unless they were an abolitionist, who wouldn't be justified in having that fear, to be honest. And again, I'm among the thought that I think it's very unlikely that most people in today's, most people right now wouldn't be in that same category. I forgot what the professor was, who tests his students, and you'd be an abolitionist back then. Okay, tell me one thing that would jeopardize your career, all of your social relationships, everything that what's a hill you've been willing to die on that has done all of that? What's an unpopular opinion you've taken that has sacrificed all of that? So I'm not saying that we're better than them, not at all.
Absolutely.
Of course, all of us want to think that we would be abolitionists, that we'd be helping the Harriet Tubmans. But we don't know. I don't know.
And a good point.
I would, but I don't know.
Right, and a good point on this, and something that you gotta take a leap of faith to kind of agree with this statement. But I think another person like you and I will be talking and having this exact conversation in 50 to 100 years about abortion. It's the exact same thing. We all think it's fine now, and guess what? It's not going to stay that way. It's the most obvious. The science goes that direction. Compassion goes in that direction, and we are going to be looked at as barbarians.
The fact that people like Ben Shapiro think that the issue that falls in that category is veganism as opposed to abortion.
Well, he uses abortion.
Catastrophically mind-blowing to me. I can't even wrap my head around.
So the first time, just to defend Ben, he's used this example several times, but normally when he's using that example of veganism, or at least vegetarianism, he's on a show with a leftist. So you need to grant the ground of saying, if I'm on the show with someone who's pro-abortion, I need to at least try to get them to take the leap of faith a bit easier. So Ben Shapiro has made this exact point. I know I've heard him use it. But I think he uses the veganism point, and obviously it's totally tangent, but he uses that as a softer, easier to bridge the gap than something like abortion. Because there are people who flat out will reject this, but
let me put it this way. I've never heard him
obvious.
transition from the veganism thing to the abortion thing and go, okay, now that we've talked about this, let's talk about this other thing. I don't think I've ever heard him do that. But, fair enough. That's fine. Defend Ben. I respect Ben. But he's just a person like anyone else. But the point is that there are all these issues like this that, we don't know where we would have stood, but we can look back and see where people did stand and what they did do. So Hayes is elected in 78, or he comes to, he takes office in 78. And I had this, this was a paper, I put it in the notes, and the link I sent you was a paper that was written, I believe, in 1962. It was a LSU student who wrote this big, long paper about the economics and different factors. And this is in Louisiana specifically during this time period. And she gives quotes and information about why. So, because there's, so 78 again, right, is when Hayes takes office and he pulls the troops back. But the Democrats in the South wanted to try and get blacks to vote for them. And one thing that's super fascinating, is how much race and a political ideology were linked in terms of the discriminatory practices in the South. So much of the voter suppression laws and policies that were put into place had to do with restricting Republicans as much as it did blacks. They were much more interested in restricting Republicans than they were blacks. In other words, a black that was going to vote Democrat was fine. So it wasn't actually about race. It was about the ideology. And I don't use that as a point to try and dunk on Democrats or anything.
I was going to say, so things haven't changed, is what I was going to say.
That's
right. And just a real quick, just in case
you're
anyone
not wrong, actually, about that, to be totally candid.
Oh, I know I'm not wrong. I don't want to turn this into a left versus right thing, because I think we're hitting on a better point than that right now, and that's not what I want to turn this podcast into. But real quick, just to cite what you're talking about, this is a history of the Negro voting in Louisiana from 1877 to 1906 by Alan Bain in 1962, just in case anyone wants to look it up.
62. Okay, so Alan, so it was a dude. I thought it was a girl. I'm glad you said
Allie, sorry.
Is it Allie? Okay.
You may have transitioned to by, I don't know, but it's Allie.
I don't want to assume the gender. That's good, and we can put that in the description or whatever for this. But she talks about how, and this is something that's so fascinating. So we're talking about hierarchies becoming corrupt, or they don't allow feedback. The ways in which, so her, and there's another documentary thing that I watched about Jim Crow and the way that it affected the vote, because blacks were rising up. They were resisting. Pardon me. I have a bad allergy to racist bullcrap when we're about to get into a bunch of it.
How progressive of you.
Right? And so how he talks about the way that taking the vote away was a huge priority. And I have some quotes here, but we can get into it here in a second. But the point is that we had the KKK and there's other white supremacists who were trying to intimidate blacks and remove them from the political system. But they, again, just like people are people, and they were like, no, we're gonna fight for our rights, and they did. And so what ends up happening is they start to put these laws into place to try and codify or at least reinforce, act on the fears of these white Democrats and so on and so forth. And that's where we get into some of these laws that lower black registered voting rates. So I'll provide the link. I can't remember off the top of my head, but one of the sources talks about how at one point in time in Louisiana, there were, we had black jury members, people elected to high office, all throughout the state. And then by 1900, 0.5% of blacks that were eligible to be registered voters were registered voters at the same time period, 1900. Again, this is after Plessy v. Ferguson. This is after separate but equals codified. This is after Jim Crow has been kind of moving and gaining momentum for a couple decades. In North Carolina, 0. 0% of eligible blacks to vote are registered to vote. Now, you tell me, Kevin, if you had to put a fine point or summarize what your ability to vote is in terms of a hierarchy, what would you say? What are you providing with your vote? It's this magical F word.
Feedback.
Feedback. That's right. So blacks start to succeed. They start to do well. They start to elect people, and they thought, this is the American dream is ours too, right? They start to provide feedback in the hierarchy, and the hierarchy is corrupted because it begins to insulate itself from that feedback and start to prohibit that feedback. So they introduce things like a poll tax and literacy tests, and the way that they make it toward poor whites or dumb whites, which is a lot of whites, at least from my experience from growing up in a small rural community in the Midwest, is they said, well, if your grandfather could vote, then you don't have to do any of this. And there's a quote here from, let me bring this up. I got my phone over here. Okay, so there's this guy named James Vardaman, who was the governor of Louisiana. This is later on, so he's reflecting back on what took place here in terms of the Louisiana State Convention, where they call this convention to add all these constitutional amendments to their state constitution. And he says, quote, "There's no use to equivocate or lie about the matter. Mississippi's Constitutional Convention was held for no other purpose than to eliminate the Negro from politics, not the ignorant, but the Negro." And so in 1790, which is, they wanted to wait a few years because these Democrat leagues were going around. They did these barbecues and stuff to try and draw blacks away from the Republican Party. They waited a few years, and then they had this convention. And the whole point was to eliminate any black influence in politics. And Kevin, as you just pointed out, that's feedback. The vote is feedback into the hierarchy. So just as Ida B. Wells recognized 5-6 years before that, when she says, I thought the law was going to help us here. It's not. They're not on our side. This begins to get codified in states including Louisiana, North Carolina, and so on, where they say we're going to pass laws to make it to where blacks they effectively can't vote. So this hierarchy has become so completely perverse and corrupted that it has used the system to insulate itself from feedback on an internal level. I want to see if there was one other quote I thought I wanted to put in here that was relevant, but I guess I can't find it, so that's fine. But the point is that, again, if we're going to say a hierarchy becomes corrupted, whether it's a New Hampshire hospital or the entire system of government, it becomes corrupted whenever feedback is no longer allowed to tell if, from the outside or from the bottom, hey, how are you doing at attaining or at least maintaining your goals as previously stated. Government's there to protect and maintain the rights of its citizens. The minute it starts to only cater to a small group of citizens, it's become corrupted. A hospital is there to protect you, to give you good surgery and protect your life. The minute it starts to do that and try to maintain the egos, as you said, of the surgeons, it's become corrupted. And if it's not allowing feedback, whether it's from nurses or whether it's from a racial demographic into the hierarchy to say, hey, you're effing this up, we need to change things, then it's become corrupted because it's not allowing that feedback. So that's kind of my brief take on both of those things. I have a way to bridge that to what we're talking about here, actually two different aspects, Kevin, but I'd love to hear your thoughts, at least on the Jim Crow part and how you see that as being relevant then and then now. One thing now I will say, at one point in time, whenever they succeeded, there were many southern states that there wasn't even a Republican primary for any elected office because they so sufficiently removed any Republican presence, where it was only Democrats that were even running for office in many of these southern states at this time after these different policies were implemented. So again, it wasn't just about race. It was about race. Okay, I'm not not even 1% or 0.5% trying to diminish that. But the effects, one of the effects was to make it where it was a complete hegemonic ideology here, where there was
Yeah.
no outside input. It was only Democrats. It was only these white racist.
But remember that sometime after then, the Democrats and Republicans, their marketing teams got together and decided, let's switch names, and that'll be super effective. So just remember that.
We'll link to the PragerU
little bit
video
of
that's
revisionist
4.5 minutes to show why that's completely stupid. But I appreciate the joke.
Yeah. We have some arguments, not me and you, but just generally, there's some arguments as to how to maintain a hierarchy like this. I would say Jim Crow South is a very obvious formal form of it. You have policy made to maintain the hierarchy. This is not always the case, right? And if we want to expand this some sort of global effort, I mean, that's what you saw in a lot of these communist countries emerging in the early 20th century. They added policies to make sure that you knew your position in the hierarchy. And even some places in the Soviet Union, you read this in the Gulag Archipelago, it's like you automatically get a tenor at least once in your life to go to the gulags just so you understand your spot. And then maybe we'll let you back out, right? There's another method to this. And I'm only going to mention this because I think it is relevant to today. It's something we used to refer to as fascism, although that's also been redefined. It is, I would say, could fit into your Rhode Island example, where you allowed feedback, or the veil of feedback, right? You can give feedback, but just understand the consequences of your feedback. There are some really, really bad organizations or companies that it's like you can provide feedback, but at the risk of getting fired for pushing back against the people on top. And that, that's a real thing that happens in these companies. It's also a real thing that happened in Europe during around the same time communists popped up, that this fascism that had a veil of a free market or something like that you're able to give feedback, but just understand the possible consequences you get to giving that feedback. So the example you gave, I already forgot her name, who was
Ida Wells.
Won her case. Yeah, Ida Wells, and her friends, who stood up for her, are like, well, they could give the feedback, but the consequences of the feedback were obviously not worth the trade-off, and that needs to be understood to make sure you can't push back against this hierarchy that's out there that may not be super well defined, but we all know what it is, right? Kind of a wink and a nod kind of thing. And we see it today, and ironically, and this is the most ironic thing, is it's normally the people who are yelling fascists that are the fascists, right?
Yep.
We see today. And now, and I hope I'm not jumping too far ahead or trying to skip what kind of bridge you were making to now, but, cancel culture, that's what it is. You can speak up, but understand the consequences of what happened when you speak up. Yeah. That is literally fashion. That is literally what we're seeing today. And, I've told you I'm in some conservative groups that are super anti-Trump, and they're the ones who are pushing back against this cancel culture belief. There's no such thing as cancel culture. It's like, yeah, you can get fired from your job, but that's the free market, whatever. And then they try to say, the right has participated in cancel culture, which I used to avidly agree with, but now I'm kind of thinking it's like, an example that they use is, when the Dixie Chicks came out and said they're not going to support the war in Iraq, people were using their CDs as target practice, as if that's some sort of cancel culture. It's like, no, that's not ingrained in the culture. It's a couple of hillbillies going out there shooting guns and just finding an excuse to shoot at something, right?
Also, their music sucks. So
right.
Who's to say, who's to
well,
say?
I try not to judge. Okay. I try not to judge, but
I will judge the Dixie Chicks. Yeah. Their music sucks.
I'm more of a Nickelback fan myself, as you know.
That sounds about right.
But the point here being is that's not ingrained. It's called cancel culture. It's got to be ingrained in the culture, right? And this is something that came out in the Abigail Schreier interview with Joe Rogan, is there are doctors who said they can't tell this little girl that she shouldn't transition. There are doctors who couldn't say, we don't recommend surgery, we don't recommend puberty blockers and this type of stuff, because they know the risk they have to take in order to do that.
Yep.
There isn't this feedback allowed in the system. Although you can provide the feedback in the system, there are consequences to that feedback. And that's what we're seeing.
Yeah.
That is what we're seeing, is the hierarchy at play is not formally saying you must not say these things, or they're not yet, but they're helping you understand the trade-off. And to most people, and you see people like me and you, who are the everyday guy who just wants to say one thing they believe in, but don't want to say it because they know their life can be ruined. They can get fired. There are so many things can happen that they're not allowed to do this. And that's what we're seeing today. The understanding the trade-off in this hierarchy. And then in this way, since it's not in policy right now, they can claim there is no such thing as this. You're just making it up, you're just gaslighting, whatever. It's like you don't believe in this stuff because it's not actually happening. Well, we see it all the time. We see it with professionals who are like, I can't even do what I want to in my field because I'm constrained by this very well known, but not perfectly defined, not formally defined rule that we have. That this is a consequence. This is what's going to come down on you when you speak your mind or you drift from the rigid hierarchy. That's acceptable now.
Yeah. Yeah, no, dude, you hit on so many things that are just exactly what I think about all the time.
All right, there it is. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. Make sure to join the Return to Reason Locals community and show Truman some support. You can go to returntoreason.locals.com to support his locals community, and you can also find him on ThinkSpot and YouTube by searching Return to Reason. And you can also find him on Twitter at MyMundaneMind. And as I said at the beginning of the show, I want to take a quick moment to share different ways you can help support this content. There are a few easy ways to do this. You can follow me on Twitter at ENG_politics. You can give me a follow on Parler at Engineering Politics. You can join the Facebook group named Engineering Politics, where I share and discuss content with the Facebook community. You can also subscribe to my video channel on YouTube under the channel name Engineering Politics, where you can find the video version of each podcast. I'm also active on ThinkSpot, which is a discourse-generating application that promotes intelligent and honest conversations while discouraging the trolling and nonsense found on most social media platforms. You can find all of my podcasts and videos on there as well. But the best way to interact with me, get the newest content, and support this podcast is the Engineering Politics Locals community. This is an amazing community that goes far beyond just a membership platform intermediary for creators. It allows followers of this content to get together and discuss the newest articles, podcasts, and videos all in one place. I strongly urge you to join the Engineering Politics Locals community at engineeringpolitics.locals.com. You can become a member for free, and now you can get a 3-month free trial when becoming a subscriber if you use promo code EPFREE. That's spelled EPFREE, no spaces. I would love to have your support with your subscription so this content can remain independent and keep growing. Monthly subscriptions to the Engineering Politics Locals community start as low as $2 per month. So I hope I can count on your support so I can start making higher quality podcasts and subscriber content like the bonus content at the end of most shows, and the new video series, the EP Zone, available only in the Engineering Politics Locals community with a subscription pass. I appreciate your consideration. Let's build a community together. Thanks for listening. This is the Engineering Politics Podcast. None of the persons, podcasts, books, or other references other than engineering politics used in this work directly reflect my ideas and/or personal beliefs, nor should they be held accountable for anything said during this podcast. Thank you for listening.